welcome to Knowing Jesus Week 29 Deep Dive. Joined again with Chris, our St. Charles campus pastor, and we're looking at a fun passage.
Yeah, you allowed me back.
You know what? You got the pass. We're looking at a fun passage. This is one that I think we like to, at least in Christian circles, reference as anytime we're talking about righteous anger. Specifically. But Jesus is going to be clearing the temple. So we're in the last week of his earthly life before his death on the cross. So we've spent time on the triumphal entry, and now he's going to the temple, and he's gonna I would say bust heads, but he doesn't. I mean, he doesn't hurt people.
Right.
He does make a whip. Anyway, so before we dive into this passage, Chris, I want to ask you. This is something that we see in three of the Gospels, so the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, towards the end as part of that last week of Holy Week. But in John, we see this type of situation earlier in his ministry. So, is this something that John, he just puts in a different place? Is this something that Jesus has a pattern of going into temples and knocking over tables? What's going on here?
Yeah, it's a little bit contested. It's a little bit debated. If you read some commentaries and people who have done PhDs on things like this, and there is a camp that says, well, maybe John just intentionally put it non-chronological, earlier in the story, out of order. But I think where I would land and where there's a good camp too is that this actually happens twice. So early on in the ministry of Jesus, when he's less famous, less popular, he goes in. Maybe it's it's not after the triumphal entry. Maybe it's a little more subtle, but he cleanses. And then also you have roughly give or take 3 years later a second cleansing of the table, which after obviously comes after the triumphal entry. So. They're a lot more on guard. They're a lot easier to anger this time around.
And I didn't mean to say he's triumphal entry, coronation, throwing tables, right? But at least as we read in Mark, it is right after.
Very soon.
We didn't talk about him cursing the fig tree. Which is an interesting thing that maybe if we have time at the end, we'll kind of go back to. So we're going to be in Mark chapter 11, starting in verse 15. Just kind of go verse by verse. If you want to stop me at any point, interrupt. If there's anything you want to highlight, I might ask a couple questions here. A couple of questions we'll kind of get to is, hey, why was Jesus so mad? That's what triggered him in this story. So verse 15. And they came to Jerusalem. So this is Jesus and his entourage, if you will. And he entered the temple, and he began to drive out those who sold and those who bought in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold pigeons. So there's already a lot of just a few little details here. But it's not like he walked in and, sat down and surveyed, almost immediately. You almost get this impression that he knew what he was going to be doing when he went into the temple. So what happened here, right? All we really have, at least at this point, is that there are people who are buying and selling stuff in the temple. So what's that about? What were they doing? And why did that anger Jesus?
So there's a couple different things going on here. This would have been the court of the Gentiles that they're doing this in. So there's different courts.
So you have the temple with different kind of spaces.
Right. Jewish men, Jewish women, and then outside of that, you had Gentiles. So we see in Solomon's time and we see in the Old Testament that this courtyard is supposed to be the courtyard for the nations. Where they can come and worship and pray and engage with Yahweh, even if they're not ethnically Israel.
Gentile equals not Jewish.
Right. So they could have had, belief in Yahweh without being an Israelite. So this is the place that is set aside for them. So it's supposed to be a house of prayer, a house for all nations. And what's happening is there's kind of three big things happening. One, there's some most likely some extortion going on with the selling of sacrificial animals. So if you're a pilgrim coming from a long way away, and if you don't have a ton of money, you're probably not going to have a large livestock animal. So you're going to have to buy a dove.
Yeah.
So picture, you go to Busch Stadium, and on the menu at Busch Stadium, right, they jack up the prices.
Yeah.
A Bud Light's like $50.
Yeah.
Okay? So same thing. Like the doves are being way overpriced. Another thing that's happening is they would have had Roman money. Well, Roman money can't be spent at the temple because it's got the homage to Caesar. Like there's some idolatry components going on here. And so that's problematic. So they've got to exchange the money. Like if you traveled abroad, if you traveled internationally, you'd have to change your American money out for something else. Same here. So the currency was Tyrian currency. It's similar to a shekel. So you got to go from the Roman money to shekel. So those exchange rates are out of whack.
Yeah, your money is no good here.
Right.
You got to...
Yeah, so it's like going to one in the airport. It's going to be way worse than like going to another
It's a great illustration.
And then it's also a cut through. So like growing up, maybe you grew up in a subdivision that like a house or an alley in between houses was a cut through. Maybe it was someone's backyard. Who knows? So people are using it also as a cut through.
Using the temple
for
as
like,
a cut through.
For like commerce and travel. So there's 3 strikes, you're out, Jesus is angry. And it's visceral, like it's a gut. He's not like theologizing. He's not like processing this for a long time. He walks in, he sees it, and then he reacts in righteous anger.
Yeah. And not like impulsively.
Right.
It's calculated. He knew what he was doing. I think whenever you hear preachers talk about righteous anger, that's something that often comes to mind. Like even James later will be like slow to be angry, right? Like Jesus isn't sinning in his anger.
Yeah. It's not a temper tantrum.
He's not just throwing a fit. Got a 3.5-year-old and a 1.5-year-old.
Yeah, good luck.
And the 1.5-year-old has been, it's almost funny. Like you don't want to like laugh at it, but like she's like laying on, when she's upset, she will sit down on the ground and then she will turn and lay on her belly and she just is throwing a fit.
It's good strategy.
Yeah. I mean, we can't really do much about it except, okay, we're going to walk away, take away your audience, and maybe that's the thing. So Jesus, he is upset because the space that this was all happening in, not only are they taking advantage of people, but the space that this was happening in had a purpose. I want to get there in a second. Because I think that's the biggest part of this. And I think for us, even when we think through like what is church in a 21st century, like these are things we probably need to be mindful about in our own ministry practices. Cool. And then and then the pigeons, right? The seats of those who sold pigeons. I do think this is a unique detail here. He's not, because you could sacrifice goats, you could sacrifice other animals,
calves.
Pigeons often are the people who they can't afford,
lower income,
right? And so you almost have a commentary here on one of the things that makes Jesus upset is when those who are impoverished are taken advantage of. Like that's a big deal.
Yeah, and they've made the pilgrimage all the way to Jerusalem, to the Temple Mount. I mean, these people are making the walk. They're ascending from miles away. Even from like Jericho to Jerusalem, you're talking, 18 miles and 3,000 feet of elevation gain. So it's a ways up.
It's big. Yeah, it's a long thing. Yeah, no, it's good. All right, verse 16. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. So that's kind of, I think, speaks to the alleyway.
The cut through.
The cut through.
Yeah.
No, if you're coming here, you're coming for a purpose. 17. And he was teaching them and saying to them, I do think this is interesting, right? In the midst of this scene where Jesus, and I don't think it comes in this passage, in a different passage, you see Jesus fashion the cord of, basically make a whip to drive people out. But in the midst of this moment, he's now teaching them. At least that's the word that Mark uses, is teaching them. It's interesting because every time I think I've pictured this scene, I'm like, okay, Jesus, he ain't teaching anybody. He's just saying, you get out of my house.
Yeah, no, it's not like, hey, I'm going to trash your place of commerce and then dip. Like, it's a learning moment. It's a teaching
calculated moment.
Yes.
As we've seen throughout this whole series, right? Jesus is, if if nothing else, he's intentional.
Yeah.
Right? He's intentional with moments. He's intentional with people. He's intentional with, even in this scene. He was teaching them. He was saying to them, "Is it not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers'?" Man, may that never be said, right, about us in the church.
Yeah.
Like that's sobering.
Yeah, I mean the fundamental sin here, like don't get me wrong, extortion is bad. I think we would all agree extortion is bad.
Yes.
But the fundamental thing that Jesus is extremely angry at here is probably not the extortion. It's that Israel, the people who were to be a light to all nations, to all Gentiles, have now abandoned their call completely and have overrun the court of the Gentiles as a cut through in a place of commerce, and so they are ignoring and abandoning the call God gave them. So like extortion is kind of the symptom, but that's not the real cancer. The cancer here is that Israel has gone astray, has abandoned their call to be a light to all nations through the works of their hands and the words of their lips, and there's no room to pray and worship for the Gentiles who have made the track.
That's the thing, right? Is they have disrupted the ability of anyone who's not Jewish to worship God. And like that, and Jesus, he holds that very significantly. Like he said, that's a big deal, because like the Jewish people, and I'm putting myself in one of their, the eyes of a Jewish man, right, in that space, like they can go further into the temple, so their worship isn't being disrupted, right? But for the non-Jewish person, this is as far as they can go. If they are coming to the temple to worship God, this is it. Yeah. So there's almost this like apathy towards everyone else. And if you read through the prophets, like the fundamental role of the people of God, of the people of Israel, the people, the Jewish people, was to be a light to the nations. It was to live in a way that was attractive. It was to embody the characteristics of God to the world, so that the whole world, and that's that Genesis 12 with Abraham, that whole, hey, blessed to be a blessing. And that they've not only have they forgotten it, they've just thrown it out the window. Yeah.
Yeah, their identity as a people is a far cry from what God intended them to be. And that's the Judaism that Jesus steps into. And so that's why he has very strong rebukes. Like Jesus' harshest words are always for the covenant people. It's never for the outsider.
That's good. It's good. I mean, it's not good, it's bad, but it's that's a good point, right? Yeah. And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they were seeking a way to destroy him, which again is interesting, because Jesus here is doing what the chief priests and the scribes should be doing, right? Like they're the ones who are. I mean, they are the leaders of the Jewish people. They are the religious leaders. They are the theological leaders. They are the political leaders. Like, and Jesus is doing what they are called to do. Again, you look at the prophets and the different, the harshest words that God has for his people are always the people who are in leadership. Yeah. And so anyway, when they heard it, they were seeking a way to destroy him. Why? Because he was disrupting their way of life.
Yeah, and they're the ones who put the stamp of approval on all that commerce and the cut-through happening in the Gentile complex. Like, without Annas and Caiaphas giving the okay, like the rubber stamp of approval, they're not setting up shop in there. Like, they're going to be driven out. And there's actually a lot of scholars that think, was this exchange rate and all this done actually outside of the temple complex, and then like for convenience and also just total disregard for the Gentiles, like they moved it in. Like this wasn't originally where this was done. Yeah. But for like sake of convenience and lack of missional identity, they then move it much closer.
Well, practically speaking, right? If you're walking hundreds of miles to get to the temple to worship, you're not dragging your family cow along with you. Yeah. Right? Like it's always easy. Like just from a pragmatic standpoint, like this process probably needs to happen Probably needs to happen around the temple or close to. But I don't know. Maybe one day it was raining and they're like, oh, hey, let's just leave. Let's just do it inside so that we're not, you know. And I don't know. Like, oftentimes I think convenience, something that starts out as maybe not a horrible idea, quickly devolves into a really bad one.
Well, and here's the heartbreaking thing. The priests have a front row seat to Torah, to the covenant. Like, they have privileges that many other people do not have. And yet their hearts are probably the furthest from God. Whereas the Gentiles, who have to travel the longest distance to even be near the temple, actually have a heart that's much nearer.
That'll preach.
Yeah, so that's, I mean, it's sad. Like, it's a sad state of Israel that Jesus steps into.
That's good. Anyway, they're seeking a way to destroy him, for they feared him, because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. We see these words, you know, especially the word astonished, I think, as it shows up in Luke, kind of in the Greek like that. There's a purpose, right? They're not just like being amazed, like God's doing something, he's revealing truth. And he's using Jesus like to do that. And so the crowd is astonished at his teaching. They see it as true. It's revealing something to them about who God is and about his ways. And when evening came, they went out of the city. So this whole kind of event transpires, and then Jesus and his entourage, right? They go out. So anything else from this passage that you want to hit on?
I want to talk about figs.
Yeah.
Just a little bit.
Go for it.
We got to talk about figs.
Yeah, so what happens right before this?
So right before this scene in Mark, there's two discourses on the fig tree.
Yeah.
So Jesus rolls up, the fig tree is not bearing any fruit. He curses it. And then when they see it after they leave, it's withered. So we have to ask ourselves the question, does Jesus' taste palate hate figs? Or like, what's happening here? And what's happening is that this is actually a bookend, right?
Yeah.
Like, he doesn't just hate figs. And so this is, you could argue this is a chiastic structure, which is where...
Dude, everyone who reads the New Testament wants to... They want to find a chiasm.
Right, you want to find a chiasm. So you want to build towards the quintessential truth, so to speak. Yeah. And then you build away from it, and it's kind of identical on both sides. So it's kind of like a bookend.
The two things on the end highlight the thing in the middle.
Right. Yeah. So you got the pretzel bun.
Yeah.
And then you've got the burger in the middle. Okay. So the fig trees are highlighting that. And the fig tree...
Did you go to the tattooed dog for lunch or something?
Yes. We did just come from the tattooed dog for lunch. So that's where I'm getting that from. Thanks, Brad. Yeah. I did not opt for the salad. I did not have good discipline like Terry. But so yeah, the fig tree is representative of Israel. Like, they're not bearing fruit. Like, the fig tree had leaves. It looked like it was kind of fruitful. It had the appearance or the facade, but there was no fruit. So Jesus curses it. So in the fig tree, we see pointing to the inner spiritual reality of Israel. So the fig tree has no fruit, but is ripe for judgment. And so that's what we see in the that's what we see in the temple complex. Yeah. Trying to be punny today. Yeah. So the temple complex scene and the fig tree, they're all working to point to the inner reality of Israel.
Oh, that's great. I do want to ask you this, because we've been, I think throughout our conversations with the Gospels, like we are, it's easy to be critical, right? To be, to look back at history on this side of the cross, on this side of Revelation, right? It's easy to be critical of the disciples.
Yeah.
It's easy to be critical of the Jewish leaders.
Yes.
And the Jewish people as a whole.
Yeah.
And often I think whenever we read, especially narrative, right, in Scripture, the question is who should I be identifying with in this story?
Yeah.
And like, I think we want to identify with Jesus. Like, oh, we're going to go in, we're the reformers, we're going to, do things the right way, when probably the proper way to read this would be identifying with the Jewish leaders. With the
or someone taking a goat through the cut through.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I don't know. Maybe not all of us would have been the high priest, but we're taking the goat through the complex and just trampling on the court.
Yeah. So then I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this.
Yeah.
But we see Jesus being very critical of the Jews, of their religion, of this blessed people of God.
Yeah.
Where do they fit into the story now?
Yeah, well, I think when we look at the New Testament...
We only have a couple minutes, so I'm throwing you that softball, right?
Okay, Spark Notes. So, like, as we look at the New Testament as a whole, the message of Jesus, and then also going into the epistles, the writings of Paul, we see that the gospel is now... Like, faith is now defined... is the defining element of being a son of Abraham. Yeah. It's no longer ethnicity. So I would say that the Jews in this day, the same as the Gentiles, like they have access to faith and belief, which ironically will then make in them a new heart that is a true son or daughter of Abraham.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what we see. Paul builds theologically on the teachings of Jesus, right? And he says, hey, if you believe in Jesus, you are now a son or daughter of Abraham. So the ethnicity thing is now not the defining factor, it's faith, and that faith is on offer to the Jewish people.
Yeah. Yeah, and from the beginning, even this is the argument that Galatians makes, like, yes, God loves the Jewish people. They are his chosen people.
Yeah.
But the entry mark, if you will, to the people of God has always been the condition of the heart.
Right.
And the matters of faith. Even Abraham, right? He's justified by faith. God chose him, but he was justified, right, in his response. And even through the people of God in the Old Testament, right, it's that same thing. He's very concerned with the inward workings, the inward commitment, the inward identity. And so what we would say is God still loves his chosen people.
Yeah.
And we should be praying that they find atonement in what Jesus has done on the cross.
Yeah. Yeah, like even though during Jesus' time, like it's not a great look for the majority of Israel, that doesn't mean they're like too far gone from salvation. I mean, Peter denies 3 times and goes on to be a pretty big part of the New Testament church. So it's a pretty big deal.
Cool. Good stuff, man.
Yeah.
Well, hope this conversation has been edifying to you. It has been to me for sure. If you want to find more of our Knowing Jesus, our deep dives, you can go to our website, calvary.church/knowingjesus, or you can find all of them on our YouTube channel as well. And we invite you when you're there to hit that subscribe button. That way you're not missing any content in the future. We hope that you have a great week. And as we prepare as a church, as a community, to step into Holy Week, to step into Easter, we hope that it's a time of reflection. We hope that it's a time that God uses richly in your life. And we're looking forward to worshiping with you, reflecting, singing, and learning together as a community. Catch you next time.